our country, is in crisis, deep political crisis. But after this, what will come is this geopolitical system will be different. The fundamental difference being that the economies of each of these countries are in some way blocking the possibilities of war. It is more moving toward economic power than from military power.
Our next guest is George Friedman, founder and chairman of Geopolitical Futures and the founder and former CEO of Stratfor. He holds a PhD in government from Cornell and has briefed the U.S. military and intelligence communities for decades. He's the author of several New York Times bestsellers, including The Next 100 Years and The Storm Before the Calm. Welcome to the show, George. Good to see you.
Happy to be here.
During President Trump's meeting with Xi Jinping in China, Xi opened the summit by asking the question, can the U.S. and China avoid the Thucydides trap? Tell us about the concept and offer your own answer to this question.
My take is he doesn't want a war, and the U.S. and China can't fight a war. How do we fight it? What kind of war would we fight? He doesn't want the tension either. He has a fundamental economic problem. China's economy is vast. It is the second largest economy in the world. Per capita income in China ranks it as 71st, very low level. So in other words, it is impossible for that product that they produce, the product they produce, to be consumed in China. The domestic market can't support that economy. They must be exporters. The largest country to which the largest exports they have is to the United States. The United States is critical in developing China's wealth by importing also massive investments by U.S. companies in China. Therefore, he doesn't have an option if he wants to maintain his economy, but to have a relationship with the United States that's favorable to him. Trump, I think, knew this and posed the tariffs on China to force them into this position. And I think for a large extent, he put the tariffs on other countries as well, so that he did not signal out China, so it did not humiliate China or anything like that. I think he came to power because I say this not knowing him and knowing that everybody thinks he's an idiot. I think he came to power thinking that he had to have a collaboration with China, that China would not be collaborating unless he put pressure on it. Thus, from my point of view, the tariffs were particularly focused on China so that they moderate, to some extent, exports to the United States. But the Chinese badly need outside investment as well in order to make their economy grow. And they are now no longer a communist power in any meaningful sense. They are a country which is authoritarian, guides the economy to some extent, but many times Xi has said it's the private sector that's the essence of, in those words, is the essence of the Chinese economy.
Do you think it's possible for two powers to dominate the world simultaneously? In other words, a bipolar sphere in which we have opposing ideologies?
I'm not sure the ideologies are opposing at this point. China is built on business. It is built on corporations, production, employment, and all the variables. The principle of Marxism-Leninism, aside from the authoritarianism to some extent declining inside of China, is irrelevant. Maoism is gone. China is now a major economy, and as such, it has to operate in those terms. It can't decide to go to war with its greatest customer, the United States.
Oh.
I think we should get away from the ideology part. The Chinese will officially claim to be whatever they want to be. But in practice, they have emerged as a massive capitalist country with great inequality, as such that countries have, and not worrying about that inequality. This is not Mao's China.
How has the world evolved such that we no longer have a Thucydides trap, such that two competing powers can coexist peacefully without one challenging the other with open warfare?
One is distance. Sparta and Athens were close neighbors. They had the technology to wage war against each other, and there was a possibility of one defeating the other, and therefore the other extracting the wealth of the other. In the case of the United States and China, a radical different geography exists. They are not only far away over an ocean, primarily controlled by the United States, but the Chinese moving into it as well. But how do you occupy China? How does China occupy the United States? So when you take a look at this, where the Thucydides trap was that they would lust after each other's economies, the wealth of the nations, the ability to wage war other than a devastating nuclear war, which would be of no one's interest, and exploiting the other is simply not there. So two things are happening in these talks. The one is the economic discussions, which are only being discussed in principle between the two, Xi and Trump, because many conversations have been had at much lower levels between the US and China on this matter before that, and will continue after it. Summits are not made to reach anything but decisions in principle and then seem somehow opposed. So the problem with the Chinese is they continue to have a hostile stand toward the United States militarily, it seems, and many in America think of it as hostile. The United States learned during the Arab oil embargo that it's very dangerous to be highly dependent on one nation for anything. So if the Chinese are going to be able to enter the U.S. economy more deeply, they must have a different military relationship with the United States as well. Thus, the one thing that he said about the military was about Taiwan, something that's important to them, something that may be negotiable. And even in Taiwan, there is a majority now that wants to become part of an autonomous part of China, officially part of China, but autonomous. So many things are happening in that realm. But the most important thing is where the Cold War was basically a military confrontation with relatively minor issues on economics between Russia and the rest of the world. This is primarily an economic confrontation, neither side having any military desires against the other.
Before we continue with the video, let's talk about today's sponsor, Delete Me. Now, there's an entire industry built around collecting and selling your personal info. Data brokers collect information such as your name, address, and phone number, then package and sell it to third parties. Delete Me is designed to help reduce that exposure. It only takes a few minutes to set up, and they handle all the work in the background. They identify where your data appears, verify those listings, and submit removal requests to hundreds of broker sites. They also keep monitoring since these listings can come back over time. I've been using Delete Me for over 2 years now, and they have reviewed over 325 listings of my information. This saved me over 12 hours of searching and reviewing it myself. The reports show exactly what was found and what was removed, which makes the process transparent. Scan the QR code on the screen here or go to joindeleteme.com/David Lin, link in the description down below, and use code David Lin for 20% off. Now back to the video. I've heard analyses or criticisms, whatever you want to call it, that the U.S., in particular Trump and his administration, sold out, quote unquote, Taiwan in order to solicit help from China against Iran. How much of this statement is true?
Well, the talks with the Chinese went on long before the Iranian crisis. Second thing is, however badly Trump may have handled the war, there was another reason for having that war, which is the fear of a nuclear 9/11. So why was there a fear of nuclear 9/11? Because Al-Qaeda, which launched 9/11, is still given a presence in Iran and protected. So imagine a nuclear weapon coming in on a French flag boat, I'll pick on the French, sailing to New York Harbor and detonating. There was a reasonable fear about the nuclear plant. We attacked the nuclear plant, but failed to completely destroy it, disregarding Trump's claim. Therefore, the hope was that we could if we can't destroy it by airstrikes, we may be able to land and put them in a position that they would capitulate. Well, that hasn't happened, so that's another story. So from the Chinese point of view, this is the last thing they need. They are providing no meaningful help to the Iranians, even though they have a treaty that was signed in 2001 to be there. And they have stated openly two things that are very important. One, they want the Ukraine war to end, and they will participate in that process. Interestingly, Putin is coming to China now. Secondly, they want the Iran war to end, and they need it to end because they get a lot of oil through the Straits of Hormuz. So this is a more complex thing, but at base, it is the Chinese depend on the American market for their economies. The United States also, to some extent, depends on Chinese imports because it helps with the affordability problem. It brings prices down. And there's been a case in history for many times that you wanted to have these lower priced products. So each side has a fundamental issue. Neither side fears war with each other. And issues like the Taiwan issue are significant. But interestingly, in Taiwan, the KMT party, which is the opposition party, favors becoming part of China again as an autonomous area with the ability to have relations with the United States as well. So the principle would be there, the reality would remain the same. So it's not just that we're selling out to Taiwanese people, the mood of Taiwan has shifted as well.
What ultimately do you think both sides want from each other? I'm talking about what the Chinese want from the Americans and what the Americans want from the Chinese.
The Americans, the Chinese want access to the American markets so that their massive productive capability can be absorbed there as well as other places. No one absorbs it as efficiently as the Americans do. The United States cannot be dependent on Chinese goods so long as there's a possibility of war between the United States and China. It wants a military understanding with China that under no circumstances would that war happen. And there are various ways in which you can create assurances, say, announcing whenever you're having an exercise militarily in sea, tell the other side we're exercising. No surprise attacks. So there are ways to achieve this. From the American point of view, China is a competitor. But as Trump took the people he took with him, leaders of various tech companies, there's great interest in China and the United States about the possibility of collaboration in technology. They complement it. Thus, you have two powers. We are used to, ever since the Cold War, if there are two great powers, they're likely to go to war, and possibly. This is a different dimension of geopolitics, when the military dimension declines in importance and the economic dimension rises dramatically.
On that note, as you stated, Putin is currently visiting China. What do you think Russia wants from China? Now, Russia's probably, correct me if I'm wrong, but their priorities are probably still rested within Ukraine. There's mounting pressure internally for Russia to end the war as their economy is weakened. This is something you wrote about. And as such, they have an incentive to end this war and reach a settlement. How can the Chinese fit into their objectives? I'm talking about Putin's objectives with Ukraine.
In the short term, they may have relatively little influence, but they are desperate for foreign investment. Foreign investment in Russia basically dried up in the course of this war. The ability to internally invest is very limited because so much has been spent on the war. As an example, they're short of money. They're short of cash. Why? Because the central bank of Russia cannot print more money without massive inflation, which already exists there. Therefore, they have a fundamental economic problem and a fundamental military problem. One, they have demonstrated that they are too weak to conquer Ukraine, which I would have thought at the beginning they would do it in 3 months. Therefore, they are no threat to Europe. Eastern part of Russia, Central Asia, has broken off from them. The southern part of Russia, the South Caucasus, have broken away from Russia. The western part of Russia, these states like Ukraine and others, broke away from Russia. So Russia is fragmented. It's still a significant country. Its economy is a wreck. So turning to China is part of it. The Americans, Trump offered economic relations with China and investment in turn for ending the war. He could not politically do that at this time. So Russia could not do that at this time. At this point, of course, the Russians are in a desperate position. They have failed completely in Ukraine. Their economy is a train wreck. He doesn't want to talk to Trump on this, possibly, but he'll talk to Mao, heir, if you will. Very funny.
Do you think Russia may be persuading Xi Jinping to supply Iran with more weapons, thereby prolonging the Iran war, which some people say may be benefiting Russia because the oil sales from Russia need to happen to supply the rest of the world with oil now that the Strait of Hormuz is closed?
Russia may ask for that. The Chinese are not going to give him that because the Chinese want the war. They want the price of oil to go down. They're dependent on oil coming through there. And the idea that they would take the pain of an ongoing war so that Russia might be able to sell oil at higher prices, that's not there. Remember, China and Russia are not friends. Even under communism, they fought border wars against each other. Okay? Even while Khrushchev was in power, Mao called him a revisionist, deplored him and everything. The Chinese also now claim officially the eastern part of Russia, the area of Vladivostok, which the Russians occupied in the late 19th century. And they have maps drawn in which that part of Russia is seen as part of China, official maps. So when we take a look at this, there are fundamental issues between Russia and China. The most important one is that Russia benefits from the war in Iran. China loses from it. And therefore, they have volunteered openly to help end the war in Iran.
If they're not friends, then who would be China's greatest ally, or allies, plural?
Well, its greatest allies are the people who buy their most product.
Huh.
So if you are in geopolitics, depending on economic power to stabilize your own country, all right, it's your customers. So the number one customer has to be the United States. A secondary customer would be Europe, which is a question of what Europe becomes. But Russia certainly can't absorb the production they have. In that sense, I think Putin is coming with hat in hand to China to somehow negotiate between. He doesn't want to capitulate to the United States. He'd rather someone else sat in between them, and he seemed to come out reasonably. He has to end the war. Putin cannot continue the war. It has cost a vast amount of lives, money, and he's failed. And nothing indicates that he'll succeed. So he is in deep trouble inside of Russia as well.
So what do you think the conclusion of the Ukraine war would look like at this point?
At this point, Ukraine would become not part of NATO. There's no reason to put them part of NATO. As a neutral country, a buffer zone, I see it as evolving dramatically, has already evolved dramatically technologically. I see it as becoming a Switzerland, the buffer between two possible enemies that are not going to be enemies. The most important question is not what happens to Ukraine, it's what happens to Europe. Europe remains a fragmented, Europe is a continent. There's no such thing as a European position. People say, what will Europe do? Well, the French are going to do different things than the Italians. So the fundamental geopolitical question at this point is if the U.S. and China form an understanding, not a profound relationship, not an alliance, just an understanding. Russia itself is weakened. What does Europe become? Remember, the EU's GDP is larger than China's. But as a fragmented entity, it carries less weight in the world than it could. So that's the most important question at this point.
That leads me to my next question, which is what the coming or the evolving world order looks like. You've written that the post 1945 world order is crumbling. To a great extent, you wrote in an article, we are now at the pivot between the end of the system that began in 1945 and a new one 20 or so years in the making. Now that system, in principle, if not in detail, is revealing itself. In which way, George? And what does the next 20 years look like?
It'll look different fundamentally from the old one because it will not be pivoting on the possibility of war. It'll be pivoting on very serious issues in economics, in competition, and so on and so forth. But whereas the last 80 years, we lived in a world of warfare, possible nuclear warfare between the United States and Russia, constant wars fighting proxies of the Soviets in Africa and Afghanistan and all over the world, okay? Vietnam and so on and so forth. This geopolitical system will be different. The fundamental difference being that the economies of each of these countries are in some way blocking the possibilities of war. So a war between China and the United States would be catastrophic and meaningless. Fighting who controls Vietnam or who has more influence in Mongolia is irrelevant at this point. So there's a fundamental shift in not only in the geopolitical system, but the nature of the geopolitical power in that system. It is more moving toward economic power than from military power.
Does it still make sense strategically and geopolitical speaking for the Americans to spend this much money on defense and perhaps even raise their defense spending?
Well, one of the virtues of defense spending is the foundation of such things as AI. So much of the technology that emerged, for example, the microchip, was first developed in the 1950s by Texas Instruments for the U.S. Air Force. So there's a vast spin-off from military technology development and the contemporary economy. So for the United States to reduce that spending, that would also shift the burden of invention, if you will, heavily to the private sector. So if you look at defense expenditures simply as spending of money that you'll not recover if there's not a war or something like that, and you think of how the computing industry, and the AI is part of that, emerged, you now see that defense spending has dual uses in the United States.
Would you then say that for those investors and just market observers who want the deficit to be reduced by cutting things like defense, which some might argue is not necessary, they're overlooking some of these secondary benefits that you're talking about that would stimulate the economy in the long run? Is that a fair assessment to make?
I'd say primary, not secondary. So if you go back in the history of technology since World War II, the pivot was defense. All of these things emerged out of defense. We may now have nuclear reactors rather than oil. We're talking about that. That emerged from it. So it's not a marginal thing. It's been a central pivot of the American economy, and one of the ways in which the American economy grew and spread. The problem here is the debt. Debts can be handled in various ways. One way is inflating like crazy. The other way is paying it off. But all of this, when you look at the financial dimension, you look at the security dimension. The security dimension was the most important. Now other things can be attended to.
So if the post 1945 world order is breaking and a new one is emerging, what happens to the institutions built around the post World War II world order? What happens to the United Nations, the WHO, even the dollar supremacy that people have grown accustomed to?
Well, the United Nations is non-existent. It's a place you go to have meetings. It doesn't do anything. It doesn't have any influence in the world. United States nations resolutions are meaningless. It was a good idea. It didn't work. What the basis of the systems in the previous period was alliances, military alliances, the most important being NATO and the Warsaw Pact, one dominated by the Soviet Union, the other by the United States. Now, the Soviet Union has demonstrated that it is no threat to Europe. If it could not take Ukraine, it can't take Poland, which has a massive military at this point, and also is in the G20, having rapidly evolved. So at this point, the military alliances that were the foundation of the last 80 years, this, CETO, other things in Asia and so on, they become less important in many ways. And the way in which economic interdependence evolves is now more important. So this is one of the rare periods that we can't get used to because we're so used to nations being potentially hostile militarily to each other. It now becomes a question of economic competition, with wars always present, but not pivotal, and very different. So just as the post-war World War II reality was profoundly different from the one before World War I, completely different, okay, between the two world wars. So this is completely different.
Would you say then that free trade agreements are the modern day military alliance?
Free trade agreements were a tool in the Cold War. The Bretton Woods system emerged in order to make Europe more prosperous, more capable of defending itself, and so on. It was part of the Cold War. The Bretton Woods system said that free trade was essential, and the United States was willing to accept the price of free trade for the Europeans. At this point, it seems to me that one of the fundamental weapons nations have is trade, tariffs, so on. I don't think free trade as a principle that emerged after World War II is completely viable in the new age, nor is it necessarily in best interest of each of the countries. So free trade was a mantra, something we believed in fundamentally as a moral principle, but it really only took place in the context of the Cold War, just as aid to foreign nations, foreign aid, evolved as a tool in the Cold War, not out of charity. So we gave money to other nations so they did not become Soviet allies. So when we look at this age, it's not the last age with a different players. It is fundamentally different in its behavior. Not a pacifist world in any sense. There will be wars, it's the nature of things. But the idea that the global system is built around the threat of war between the United States and the Soviet Union, and this is what China is all about, and that is what Europe is all about, and everything else, that's obsolete.
Is a multipolar world emerging, George?
And a multipolar world has emerged. And so the two major countries, the United States and China, will compete for markets, perhaps. But just as you can have two companies competing for markets and possibly merge at some point, I don't believe there will be a merger here, but there can be very many relationships. However, the threat of anything but regional wars has declined dramatically. When I grew up, the dread of war with Russia, from the Cuban Missile Crisis before and after, was the foundation of what we thought about. At this point, that's not possible. The Chinese certainly have better things to do than engage in nuclear war when they get. So it's a different principle of relations.
I think investors examining where to place their money in terms of picking jurisdictions might ask the question, well, if China or any other country emerges as a competing power to the United States, would the world look like a zero-sum game, such that if one power gains, America loses? So we put money in the place that gains.
The nice thing about economics is its evolution. So evolution in the military dimension is very slow in coming. Evolution in the economic dimension is constantly emerging and diverging and so on. So nations rarely are desperately competing over who sells what to whom. Okay? They can do it in other ways. That there is going to be two major economies in the world, where there was Britain and France at some point. There were the two major economies. They didn't necessarily go to war with each other. They fought over some colonies. So the point that I'm making is, when we talk about a new world order, if you will, we're talking about something radically different than the one we just left. So the question of hostile relationships militarily between China and the United States is based on a fundamental question that has to be answered. Why? What would either gain from that? And what would the cost? For economic competition, certainly. But what Trump signaled by bringing those people with him, okay, is we can also have joint ventures.
Okay. Well, let's shift gears to talk about the Middle East. As of this morning, the 19th of May, Trump canceled the planned attacks on Iran, or additional planned attacks for today. If air power has failed and ground troops landing in Iran are off the table, what's the actual face-saving exit that Trump can expect to sell to the American public right now?
First, understanding the reason of the war, which I've already said, a genuine fear of nuclear weapons in Iran, and a reasonable one. The primary American demand is that the Iranians give up their nuclear weapons. Okay? And that comes back over and over again. I think Trump either did not listen to American intelligence, or that the American intelligence got it wrong. Iran is a powerful country. It's vast, and it has a major force. And the government that was killed at the first attack was not the government of Iran. It was a face of it. The government of Iran is the commanders of the IRGC, the Islamic Republic. Okay? And they built a military structure that's called the Mosaic structure, which means each region is free to defend itself under its own command. So if the central command were destroyed, each region would be trained with orders. And this has about 35 mosaic tiles. Therefore, the idea that the United States would invade on land is, I hope, out of the mind, because the casualties would be massive, as we have discovered in other wars. So what has to happen here is some sort of understanding of nuclear capabilities, which the Iranians don't want to give, which frightens us even more. But other countries may come in, and the Chinese have said they want to end the war, and they need to end the war. So I expect other countries to be putting pressure on Iran to get rid of their nuclear weapons so the war can end. I cannot imagine, I hope I can't imagine, that we would send ground forces in there. It would be a terrible price to pay, and I'm not sure we've been.
Are having nuclear weapons a non-negotiable for Iran? Their position, from what I understand, is that a nuclear weapon would present a deterrent for either the US or Israel or their allies to topple the current regime, replace them, or outright destroy their entire country. I mean, it's a fair point to make. So if we have a situation where that becomes a non-negotiable for the Iranians, and the West, meaning the US, their position is that it's a non-negotiable for Iran to not have any nuclear weapons, there we're at an impasse.
So we're at an impasse, but not. First, the idea that they need a nuclear weapon to deter an attack by the United States misses the point that the United States has never gone to war with nuclear weapons since Japan, lost wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, and so on without resorting to nuclear weapons. And this they see. So the idea of nuclear threats by the United States is fairly far-fetched. And they know that. They're sophisticated. The reason the United States worries so much about a nuclear weapon is the ideology of Iran and the fact that Al-Qaeda, as well as Hezbollah and other groups, are present in Iran under the protection of them. So if you have the group Al-Qaeda, a shadow of its former self, being protected by the Iranians, these were the ones who launched the real 9/11, and the Iranians find this so important to have, having nuclear capability so fundamentally important, you have to draw a rational conclusion that they're not doing this for giggles. They're doing this with a purpose in mind. And when you look at the ideology of the people they're working with, you get worried. So the Americans have a legitimate concern about the thing. That is the only thing they demanded of Iran. Iran has refused to give that, and that increases the American concern. So the idea that Iran does not pose a threat to the United States, potentially, okay, is a poor reading of the situation. Can the United States accept a country with nuclear weapons that gives sanctuary to Al-Qaeda? That's the question.
Why is the United States so worried, fundamentally speaking, about Iran possessing nuclear weapons? I thought that the principle of mutually assured destruction would mean that the Iranians or any group or nation that they sponsor would be insane and suicidal to use nuclear weapons. Therefore, it would never happen. It doesn't really matter ultimately if they possess it or not.
But the principle of mutually assured destruction depends in part on ideology. The Soviets had the ideology, we do not want to be devastated. The Americans had that ideology. The fundamental question is, if you believe what the Iranians say and how they act, that ideology is not present. There is, in the Islamic world, a tendency towards suicidal actions and actions that they will never be destroyed for. The Hamas invasion of Israel was suicidal in the sense that Hamas, in the end, would be destroyed. And they're willing to take that risk. So the question here is a cultural one. The United States, Soviet Union, Europe, China, it's okay, absolutely does not want to risk nuclear war. But we see Iran as having a different ideology, a different government. And we also see it's a very small thing to ask not to have nuclear weapons, given that we're not invading on the ground and so on. Their urgency in having them raises another question. So MAD only works when both sides have the same fundamental moral and realistic values. In the view of some, Iran has a very different one. Not all Islamic countries have this by far, but Iran in particular has this capability that MAD may not work.
So what ultimately do you think are the conditions that both sides would agree to for the war to end?
Well, a fundamental decision has to be that neither side be humiliated. All right? The United States does not want to be humiliated. Iran doesn't want to be humiliated. But if the United States makes it clear that it will not end the war, it is in the interest of China in particular to intervene. And they have been involved in negotiations. And they've said they would use their offices not only in Ukraine, but to end the Iranian war. So for China, deeply dependent on oil, this war is a pain in the neck, at the very least. Secondly, if they act in this way, they can extract concessions from the United States, possibly on economics. So, one of the dimensions of the summit in Beijing really has to be this Iran war. Now, I think that the fundamental reason for it is rational. I believe that the way that Trump executed it was irrational. It was based on false intelligence. He destroyed the government, he thought, and called for an uprising of the people, failing to understand or failing to be told that he had not killed the government of Iran. They're still there, the RGC. So we take a look at the two things, the geopolitical imperative to deal with it, and then the engineering part, where all things can go wrong. So the engineering assumed something about Iran that was fundamentally wrong. We need to withdraw from it. And one of the things I think the Chinese are going to do is help us do that in a way that doesn't humiliate Iran or the United States and gives them a very good bargaining position on other things.
All right. I want to turn finally to your book. It's called The Storm Before the Calm. America's Discord, the Coming Crisis of the 2020s. This book was published in 2020, right at the onset of COVID. And I wonder if a lot of the, aftermaths of COVID have played out the way you predicted in this book.
Well, we're certainly in a storm internally. Mm-hmm. That reminds me of the 1950s when we were in a storm internally as well over the Vietnam War, race, and all other issues. Okay. So what we're in is a socioeconomic crisis. However, I said this is a storm before the calm. And we're nearing the point where the storm should subside. Why it should subside is historical. I see some elements of it dying down. So the book's name was The Storm Before the Calm, and it was written before the 2020 publication, and it projected the storm. Now I'm looking at the calm that's going to happen. Just like in 1975, Nixon and Watergate ended, the Arab oil embargo, we were in a situation of transition that finally happened when Reagan took office and changed the tax program and so on and so forth.
What was the internal conflict that you had predicted?
The internal conflict was not the one I didn't predict what it would be. I just knew it would be one. So this goes back to the founding that every 50 years, there's this sort of crisis, and it was due. But I did not know what it would be. And I never thought. But I do know that these crises always end, and the calm that follows is a golden age. And so this has been, I don't know why this is 50 years, but I know why it is in America. This is an invented country. We live with the principle of obsolescence and reinvention in every dimension of our lives, personal and economic and so on. So this is how you evolve. First, creative destruction. Second, reconstruction of something new. So that's the cultural thing that in my mind that drives it. What the crisis will be like, I had no idea. That there would be a storm was predictable.
Do you think automation will create the storm? Meaning the creative destruction that will come from automation will probably exceed that of the Industrial Revolution of the early 20th century. Before we have abundance for everybody, there's going to be massive layoffs, perhaps permanent damage to some sectors of the economy. And a lot of people will suffer greatly from their standard of living.
I just wrote a piece called The Dilemma of AI. One, it can succeed, the other can fail. It can fail with the singularity, the idea that it will evolve dramatically. They may be vastly overestimating it, just as the auto industry, when it got into trouble, tried to build autos that were also boats, which never got off the ground. Secondly, they may not be able to do the things that they're saying. So if they do it, there will be a massive reaction to that. If there's massive unemployment in a country, a massive store comes out. But there's a time, I don't think that'll happen. I think the ability of the United States to absorb new inventions with some social discord, but fundamentally take them. When we take a look at how we use the railroads and cars, everything else, television was supposed to be radical in that students would no longer attend school, they would be taught by television. The claims that are made for technologies, when the railroads were created, there was a serious thought about a transatlantic railroad. Okay? So we're at the point, I won't call it the point of fantasy, but the point of over expectation about what AI can become. Mm. Certainly, if AI makes human labor irrelevant, there's a fundamental problem. But the singularity that a super intelligence beyond that of humans will emerge is extraordinary. And I find dubious.
Okay. My final question before we wrap up. Thank you very much, George, for your time. Which geopolitical development or event this year do you think would have the most impact in moving world events and current affairs? What are you looking forward to the most, in other words?
Coming of the crisis inside the United States toward the end of this. So the most important thing is the United States remains the pivotal country in militarily, economically, and so on. Okay? Yet that country, our country, is in crisis at this point. Deep political crisis. And we see that in not only Trump's presence, but this is discord about Trump. Terrible ratings, okay? But after this, what will come is as it happened in the 50s and after the Great Depression, everything else, a reconstruction of American life. And that really is what we could expect. We're in this position, we always think we're finished, no hope. It turns out there's something new coming.
Okay, George, thank you very much. Where can we follow your work?
At geopoliticalfutures.com.
Okay, we'll put the link down below, so make sure to follow George and geopoliticalfutures.com. Appreciate it once again. Thank you for coming on the show. Welcome to the program, and I wish to speak with you again soon. Take care for now.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe.